Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my research on this platform. And so I'm just going to start off with a statistic that was introduced, was stated by the Worldwide Fund for Nature in 2017, which is that per year it's estimated that 9.4 million tons of food is wasted in South Africa. And we can just, by that statistic, see what the true issue is and how big of an issue food waste is. And so owing to this problem, food waste that comes from the retail sector is what this research focuses on. And we just need to distinguish between food waste and food loss. Food loss occurs very early in the food supply chain, so that occurs during your harvesting phases, whereas food waste is predominantly seen in the relationship between the retailer and the consumer. And so in just starting with this presentation, it's important to understand why food waste is a socio-ecological issue. Firstly, on an environmental scale, when food is sent to landfill, we see the emission of many greenhouse gases, such as methane and carbon dioxide, when it decomposes, and that very much contributes to global warming. And then secondly, and I think very obviously on a societal platform, when we are looking at communities who are living in circumstances of extreme poverty and are battling food security on a daily basis, especially during the time of COVID-19, we see how food waste really impacts these communities. And another statistic to add to that is in 2017, 10.4 million people in South Africa did not have access to sufficient nutritious food. And so in understanding how food waste impacts people on an environmental level as well as a social level and the connected nature of the two, we can also then understand that there are two very important rights within the South African Constitution that we need to discuss and keep in mind. And that is Section 27 of the Constitution, which is the right to food, and Section 24 of the Constitution, which is the right to an environment not harmful to one's health. So in this research, there are two main questions. And the first question is, does South African waste legislation adequately manage food waste emanating from the retail sector? And furthermore, which we will see later on in my discussion, do the standards that regulate food safety and consumer protection conflict with one another? And secondly, in looking at these issues, can the solution of donating surplus excess food provide for a way in which we can curb food waste? And during this research...
Sorry, Jessica, sorry just to interrupt you. I'm not sure whether you forgot to share your screen or it's by intention.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. Let me just double check.
No, it's okay, it's okay.
Okay. Oh, there we go. I'm so sorry. Can everybody see now?
Oh, yes, we can see now.
Okay, great. Thank you. And so in continuing in this research, there were two considerations that I really thought about. And firstly, that was in South Africa, there's not a lot of case law that discusses food waste and the impact of food waste. And therefore, that is why I started to look at foreign trends that really aimed to combat food waste. And secondly, when we look at foreign trends that aim to combat food waste, I really thought about how we would be able to apply it to a South African, in a South African context and into our own environmental and social context. Okay, let me just, why is it changing? Okay, so why is food wasted in retail? Predominantly, this is because of the date marking structures and the dates that by law must appear on food products. And I think we're all very familiar with these dates. These are the best before dates, the sell by date, and the use by date. And the problem with these dates is that among the public, there's a very large misconception about what they actually mean. And so that's where we see a large waste of food that is actually edible food that exists in surplus. And that is the food that is being sent to landfill. And so the applicable legislation that we are going to look at is firstly the National Environmental Management Waste Act. And this act really does a good job of defining and categorizing expressly provided for in the act. And furthermore, the act does not differentiate between food waste and food that exists in surplus and therefore is just sent to landfill. Secondly, the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act, which is the legislation that provides for why specific dates need to be applied to food. However, while these dates appear on food products, when they occur, it does not actually mean that food is unsafe to eat, but rather that this food won't retain the same qualities that we know it to have. And furthermore, it's actually for the retailers' and so that is where the disconnect comes in, and that is where we see the problem. And then lastly, the Consumer Protection Act, which provides for strict liability toward a producer or a retailer if they provide a person with a product that is harmful. And so in understanding how these three pieces of legislation inform one another, we see that while food that is edible, even when, for example, the best before date has arrived, there are many retailers who, out of fear of being held strictly liable, do not end up donating this food, do not end up utilizing this food, and therefore it is sent to landfill. And so we see that there is sort of a barrier between the Foodstuff, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act and the Consumer Protection Act. And subsequently, because of this barrier, waste or food that exists in a surplus is not managed effectively and isn't utilized in a way that it could be for many communities in South Africa. And so in researching the solution of donation and by looking at international trends, I looked at two different countries, and that would be the United States and France, who have really taken a couple of steps in attempting to curb the food waste issues. And it was important for me to understand how this could work in a South African context, especially when we look at section 16 of NEMA, which talks about placing a responsibility on those who are generating or utilize waste in a positive way. And so in starting with the United States of America, in terms of the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Act, this act really focuses on reducing retail liability. So it allows for retailers to donate food to non-profit organizations, governmental organizations, who will then decide what kind of food can be donated to communities in need. And these retailers or the people that donate food will not be held as strictly liable unless they are grossly negligent. In states such as Massachusetts and California, we have waste diversion plans, and so certain companies that produce a certain amount of organic waste have to, by law, recycle that waste, and that waste is not allowed to be sent to landfill. And then lastly, we have certain kinds of legislations that allow for a tax incentive. And so from an economic perspective, that is really fantastic. Many companies can donate food, and they will be provided with an economic benefit in that way. And then secondly, in looking at France, it takes a very strictly ban food waste in supermarkets. So supermarkets must, under law, enter into a contract with a specific governmental organization of their choice, and they have to donate food that has not been bought, and in turn that organization will also distinguish between food that can be donated. France also places a lot of emphasis on the language that they use in their legislation. And so when they talk about food that exists in surplus, they make it very clear and differentiate between food that can no longer be eaten and food that can be eaten. And this is also due to a large involvement from the public. A lot of people in France completed surveys and signed petitions for this law to be enacted. And so public involvement is also something that's very important within the law. And so in considering this in South Africa, we do have a couple of meaningful steps that have been implemented to curb waste in general. However, a lot of these steps omit organic waste. So for example, in 2018, there were certain materials that are banned from landfill. These included certain types of organic waste, but there is no specific mention of food waste. Secondly, we have a target that talks about banning organic matter. and 50% of that organic matter is aimed to be diverted from landfill by 2022. But there has been no mention of how successful this has been, and there has been no mention about enacting legislation to this effect. And then lastly, we also have a draft regulation which talks about excluding certain kinds of matter. And there is no mention of food waste in being able, or a food surplus in being excluded from this definition. And so in recommending what we would be able to do, and from looking at some of the solutions that have been implemented across the world, the first thing that I would like to state is that NEMWA needs to be amended, or we need to provide for a different piece of legislation that firstly describes food waste, and secondly differentiates between food waste and between food that exists in a surplus and food that is in fact edible. And in this way we eliminate the idea that food which is not consumed is waste. That is an untrue statement. Secondly, and in addition to amending NEMWA, we need to look at how we can reconcile both the Consumer Protection Act and the Foodstuffs, Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act by providing for, firstly, a reduced retail liability in which we allow retailers, supermarkets and grocery stores to donate food that has, for example, reached its best before date, because as we have now realized, food that reaches that date is still edible. And there has been a draft bill representing this recommendation that was introduced in 2017, and it is yet to be enacted into legislation. So that is very much a positive. And then over and above, and in addition to this as well, it would be positive to implement tax incentives, as they have done in the USA, as well as legislation that makes it mandatory to divert organic waste from landfill. So especially certain retailers that, or even certain companies that produce a certain amount of organic waste. And it's important to understand that by implementing solutions on these kinds of different levels and in these different pieces of legislation, we're really providing for a strengthened system in which we curb food waste, and also we divert organic waste, and that implementation will have advantages on both an environmental aspect as well as a social aspect. And so that concludes the entirety of my presentation. Thank you so much.